Hi everybody, and welcome to this video, which is all about the third part of creating the Coleg Ceredigion spreadsheet for Unit 19, which is spreadsheet modelling. Now, as you will have noticed, this is a video rather than a template spreadsheet that you've been working through for the first two parts of this. Because some parts of this are quite difficult to explain, so it's better done as a video. Now, if you've worked through the Coleg Ceredigion example version 1 and 2, which are on the Padlet, then your student's worksheet should look like this. You will have different data, of course, but you will have the fake but realistic student numbers and first names and surnames, realistic but not real addresses, including postcodes, the appropriate gender, and the status column where you've got drop-down lists for your enrolled and not enrolled, and you've got conditional formatting for to really show which students are enrolled and which ones are not enrolled. So your student worksheet should look very much like this, but with different data. The courses worksheet now should, if you've worked through the first two example template spreadsheets, which are on Padlet, should look something like this. Maybe with different dates, with different course funding figures, and a different selection of courses, but very much this layout. And your enrolment worksheet should look like this. The next worksheet that we're going to add is a funding worksheet, which is going to link in with some or all of the previous three worksheets and work out various financial calculations automatically for the college. So the first thing we need to do is create a new worksheet called funding, and that's very easy to do if you follow my pointer down here to this button here, which is insert worksheet. Click on that and then right click on the new worksheet, which currently is just called sheet 2 as a default name. Choose rename and call it funding. So there is the name of the new sheet changed to funding. What I've then done there is I've added the following column labels in row 1 which will tell us what each what each column is about. We've got course code, course name, course funding, number of attendees, basic funding, extra funding and total funding, and these will form the columns for this funding worksheet. So the next thing I'm going to do is the first three columns in this new funding worksheet are actually based very much on some information in another sheet. They're actually based very much on some information which is in the courses sheet. In fact, it's basically this information here in cells A2 to B14 together with the course funding information. So what we'll do, rather than, we're certainly not going to type all that in again, and we're not going to copy and paste it either, because this may change. If we copy and paste it from the courses sheet, which we're in here, to the funding sheet, then if information changes in the courses sheet, it won't necessarily change in the funding sheet. So we're actually going to link these two sheets together, and it's very easily done. Starting with the first course, which will appear in A2, I'm going to link cell A2 in the funding worksheet with cell A2 in the courses worksheet, and that's very easily done. All you do is this, you type equals. So I'm in the funding worksheet here, and then I switch to the courses worksheet and click A2 in this one and simply press enter. It skips back to the funding worksheet then, and if I click in A2, you'll see that the formula is equals courses exclamation mark A2. That's the formula, the Excel way of saying that this cell here, the cell A2 in the funding worksheet, is linked directly to cell A2 in the courses worksheet. And if the contents of cell A2 in the courses worksheet changes, then so will this one. You can actually then just simply autofill that down. I'll deliberately go too far, because then you'll be able to see then that I need to go back up a little way with the autofill handler, and that way you get exactly the right number of you get exactly the same information in the funding worksheet as in the courses worksheet here. You can do exactly the same then for the course name. So I'm going to go equals in cell B2 of the funding worksheet, then I'm switching to the courses worksheet and I'm clicking in cell B2 of that sheet and hit enter. And so it's almost like a copy and paste, except it's much more directly linked. Because if cell A2 of the courses worksheet changes, then so will cell A2 of the, get the right sheet there, of the funding worksheet. So what we're going to do then is just go ahead and do that for the course funding column as well. So it's directly linked to these cells in the courses worksheet. You can, right the way through this video, you can pause there and have a go, or you can watch the whole thing and rewind and go back. So pause there if you want to have a go at that. And after you've done so, your sheet should look like this. So that's that information copied just directly by linking the funding worksheet with the courses worksheet. And as well as being quite handy, it also meets one of the criteria of Unit 19, which is that you have to have a multiple worksheet spreadsheet, a spreadsheet with many worksheets in it. We're going to end up with, I think, 5 or 6, with at least some of them linked to each other. So that's the first 3 columns done. Now for the number of attendees column here, I'm going to introduce you to a new function which we haven't used before called the COUNTIF function. Now what this is going to do is it's going to look, again, a link with another worksheet here. It's going to look in the enrollment worksheet here, the third worksheet that we produced, and it's going to look for certain courses. For example, it's going to count the number of people that are enrolled on the IT course or on the hair and beauty course, and it's going to count the number of times it sees certain words, certain courses basically, in this range of cells, and put the result in here. And this is how it works. The formula is equals COUNTIF, open a bracket, and you tell it which range you want it to look in first of all. So I'm going to switch to the enrollment worksheet and drag this group of cells here, like that. And then that's the first, what they call the first argument of the function. The first part of it is telling it what range you want this function to look in. I'm going to switch back to the funding worksheet then. You can see it spotted that by putting funding in there. And I'm going to click on cell B2, which contains the art and design course name at the moment. Close the bracket. So you can see what it's going to do. It's a relatively complex function, this, is it's going to look at the enrollment worksheet in the cells F2 to F23, which is where all of the courses that have had an enrollment are, and it's going to look for the course Art and Design. If I hit enter there, it finds 0, because if you look back at the enrollment worksheet, there are no students enrolled on that course. And if I switch back now to the funding worksheet here, you can see there that it's correctly spotted that there are no students enrolled on the art design course. I should then just be able to autofill this down for all the other courses, and it will correctly fill those in. Or so it seems, but if you look carefully, these seem like reasonable figures, but if you look carefully, for example, at Performing Arts and Media, it's saying there are nobody is enrolled on the Performing Arts and Media. But if we switch to the enrollment worksheet, we can see that there are 1, 2, 3, 4, several, 5 or 6 people enrolled on that course. I'm not going to count them exactly, but it certainly isn't 0. The reason for that is that when we autofill down, you can see if you watch the formula here up in the formula bar, as I go down with the arrow key, you can see that the B2 changes to a B3, to a B4, to a B5, which is what we want, because we want it to be looking at a different cell in the B column here. But the cells that it's looking at in the enrollment worksheet also change as well. We actually wanted to look at cells F2 to F23 in the enrollment spreadsheet every time, these cells here. But actually that range of cells is moving down every time, each time it goes down column D here. What it actually should say, that formula, is enrollment F2, F23 all the way down, not changing to, as you can see there, F6 to F27. And if you've done the previous tutorials in this unit, you'll know that we do this, we fix that by using something called absolute cell referencing. At the moment, we've got something called relative cell referencing. So when we auto-filled, as you go down this column, you're also going down the column in the enrollment sheet. So the range we're looking at there is changing. So the first formula is correct, but the rest are not. But there's a quick way of fixing that. All you do is we need a $sign in front of the 2 there to stop that changing, and a $sign in front of the 23 as well to stop that changing as the autofill auto completes the function down the column here. So now if I do an autofill again, that looks a lot better. There's 6 IT, there's 5 performing arts. The reason for that being, if I now if I click in D2 here, and as I move down with my arrow key, watch the formula change. It changes from B2 to B3, etc. as you want it to. But that range of cells it's looking at in the enrollment spreadsheet doesn't change. It's F2 to F23 every time. And that's what's called absolute cell referencing, as opposed to relative cell referencing, by adding in the $signs there. In fact, there is a slightly quicker way of doing it than that. It's such a useful feature, absolute cell referencing, that there is a keyboard shortcut as well. If I put my cursor anywhere out there in that cell F2 and hit F4 on the keyboard, it scrolls through some options for absolute cell referencing that you might need. There, it's using absolute cell referencing for the column and the row. We don't need that in this case because it's not the column that's changing, it's the row number. So we just need that one. But there's no harm in having a $in front of the F and the 2. And in fact, that's the first click you get when you use this F4 short key here. I'm hitting F4 on the keyboard. You see how it scrolls through them, but one click takes you to that one with a $1 in front of each one. So that's a shortcut to doing that. And that's the COUNTIF function, and that's the number of attendees column completed. So you can either carry on watching the video now, or you can pause it there and have a go. The next column, basic funding, is very simple after that relatively complex COUNTIF function there in column D. The rule for basic funding is simply that a course gets the amount of the course funding for each student that they have enrolled. So for example, Art and Design will get £300 for each student they've enrolled. Unfortunately, they haven't enrolled any. Business will get £700 for each student they enroll. Catering will get £500 for each student that they enroll. So it follows that the formula here, starting with E2 here, is just the course funding times the number of attendees. So it's just a simple multiplication. So in the case of the first course here, which is Art and Design, it's simply equals C2 times, which is the asterisk, number of attendees, which is, in the case of this course, is 0. Anything multiplied by 0 is 0, so they get a basic funding of nothing, and you can autofill that down for the rest. That's the basic funding column done. So again, pause if you need to, or stay with us. So after the relatively simple basic funding formula there in column E, things get now a bit complex again in the extra funding column. Now the way the extra funding column works is that if a course has less than a certain amount of basic funding, but more than a certain amount of students enrolled, then they get the full amount of a funding allowance. So for example, a course like for example IT, our course here, we don't get much course funding per student, but we've got quite a few students. As a result, our basic funding is actually relatively low at £1,500 compared to a course like, for example, Health and Care, which has a lot of course funding per student. Not many students, but they actually get more basic funding than IT does. So the rule for extra funding is that if a course has less than £1,500 of basic funding, but more than 5 students, they get an extra amount, which is currently £1,000. What I'll do now is I'll copy and paste in the rules for that, just to make it a bit clearer on screen for you to have a look at. So here are the extra funding rules pasted in. A course gets the full amount of funding allowance, which is currently 1,000, but we need to build into the spreadsheet that may change in future. They get the full amount if the basic funding is less than 1,500, and the attendees, that's the number of students that enrolled, is more than 5. You see that's the case for IT. Yeah, we have a basic funding of less than £1,500, but we have 6 students more than 5. So we would qualify for this extra £1,000 funding allowance because we've got a lot of students and a low course funding, which leads to quite a low basic funding. So it's a way of getting more money onto the course where they might not otherwise get it. But there is another option as well. You get half the amount of the funding allowance if the basic funding is less than 1,500, so similar to the first rule, but if the course has exactly 5 attendees enrolled. And you can see actually that's the case for Performing Arts and Media, where they have exactly 5 students and a basic funding of less than 1,500. They have a basic funding of 1,250 there. Actually, if you look, take a few moments now, pause the video if you need to. None of the other courses will actually qualify for this because they don't meet any of those criteria. Now, starting with art and design, the extra funding for art and design, which will be in cell F2 there, we're going to use an if function to work out if art and design qualifies for either the full amount or the part amount. Just before I start doing the actual formula there, we're going to need a cell to refer to. We're going to call it funding allowance, and it's going to contain the number £1,000, so we can refer to that cell in our formula, because we don't want to put that £1,000 actually in the formula, because it may change, and then we'd have to change all the formulas, or at least change one of them and do an autofill. But we can save doing all of that by just creating a cell over here, putting £1,000 in it, just a figure of 1,000 here, and just a label above it in column I here saying funding allowance. So I've gone ahead and done that there. So the idea of that is, as I say, if the funding allowance changes, which it may do in future, it may go up, it may go down, then all we have to do is change that figure and not have to go to the trouble of changing our formula. So we need an if function now to calculate the total amount of extra funding based on the funding allowance for each course, starting with art and design. So we're going to start with equals if, and then we're going to, as with the if function that cropped up in the BMI practice exercise when you were building up for this first assignment here, you start off with a question, and the first question I'm going to ask is the basic funding for this course less than £1,500? And the basic funding is in cell E2. So is the figure in E2 less than £1,500? £1,500. But straight away we've got a problem, because the rule is that the course will get the full amount of funding allowance if the basic funding is less than 1,500, fair enough, but also at the same time the attendees are more than 5. There are more than 5 students on the course. So we're going to have to actually ask a 2-part question here, somehow within a single if statement. The way that's done, if I get rid of the first part of the question there, is to use the AND function, which is a logical operator, and that allows us to ask a 2-part question within a single if statement. So I'm going to go if, comma, and, comma, and then I'm going to ask my first question, which is the basic funding less than 1,500 now? So I'm carrying on as I did before, but this time I put the and in as well. That's the first part of the question. Now I'm adding a comma in. And then the second part of the question, which is D2, which is the number of attendees, greater than 5? Just take a few moments there, maybe even pause the video to see what's going on there, because that is the quite complicated question part of this if statement. And it's asking 2 questions at the same time, and both of those criteria have to be correct, have to be true for the answer to this question to be yes. And it's asking 2 questions there. Is E2 less than 1,500, and at the same time, and D2 greater than 5? Now, if the answer to that is yes, then both of those things, then they qualify for the full amount. So then I'm just going to click over here in cell I2, because if both of those conditions are met, if the funding allowance is less than 1,500 and the course has more than 5 students enrolled, then they get the full allowance. But this is where things get really fun. There is another possibility here, of course, and that is if certain other conditions are met, then the course will get half that amount. So I'm going to actually start another if statement in here. Remember nested if statements from the BMI example. I'm going to ask another question here, and again it's going to be 2 conditions to it, so I'm going with an and again. And this time it's E2 less than 1,500 again. But this time the other condition that has to be met to get half the funding is that D2 is equal to 5. That is, the course has exactly 5 students. Close that bracket. If those 2 conditions are met, then they actually get half of the funding allowance. So this time it's I2 divided by 2, which is half of it. The only other possibility is that none of those conditions are met, in which case the course will get 0 funding. That's the end of the statement there. I just need now to make sure that I close as many brackets as I open. And just looking at that fairly carefully there, I can see that I need 2 brackets to close it. So pause the video there, rewind it if you need to. Have a look at the extra funding rules down here that I've put up here, because there's a lot going on in that function there. So if you've got your hang of that, if you've got your head around that, very well done, because that is the most complex formula we're going to use in this unit. And I'm going to autofill it down, and if they all say 0 apart from IT, which will get the full amount, £1,000, and Performing Arts and Media should get 500, then we know that it's worked. And it hasn't, of course. But I did know that was going to happen, because it's another one of these things where you autofill down, and of course it's now not looking at the right cell. Our first formula is correct, but you notice if you follow the formula up in the formula bar, as I go down with the arrow keys, you can see there are certain parts of that formula that shouldn't be changing as we go down. You can see that the thing that's changing that shouldn't be is the I2, which is the cell that contains the funding allowance. And as you go down, you see it changes to I3 and I4. You can see here in this part of the formula here, and this part of the formula here, it's no longer referring to this cell. You can see it if I click in a formula. In this formula, it's actually looking at a blank cell for how much the funding allowance is. So again, it's our old friend from previously from the COUNTIF function that we did in column D over here. It's changing the relative referencing currently to absolute. So I'm going to put my cursor, a pointer there, my cursor into the I2 and press F4. It's now anchored. I think the use of dollar signs is good here because they look like little hooks, and they anchor that amount in there then. So that's changed the references, the cell references within that formula that need to stay the same. It's changed them to absolute, so they will not change when I autofill down. So let's try and autofill down again, and this time it works. IT should get the full £1,000 because they meet the conditions in the box here, and Performing Arts get exactly half of it because they meet the conditions in this part of the box. Just before we go on to total funding, which is actually a very simple formula, there is another way we could have done this, and it does meet another one of the criteria for Unit 19, and that's to use something called a named cell. Rather than, if I just get rid of these for a second here, and get rid of the absolute cell referencing in there, so they go back to I2. There is another way we could have done it, which is, as well as being quite a cool way of doing it, actually meets another criteria, and that's to actually give the name a cell, give that cell a name. So what I'm going to do is change the name of this cell, so it's no longer called I2, I'm actually going to give it the name funding allowance, and then we can use that name funding allowance within the formula. And it gets around the problem of autofilling, because when you autofill, the name of the cell just stays the same as funding allowance. It doesn't change when you autofill. It's dead easy to do. All you do is you click in the cell. If you follow my pointer over here, you can see it's currently called I2. I'm literally going to change the name to funding allowance. Now, you're not allowed any spaces in the names of cells, so I'm going to use underscore. You'll see that again later in the unit when we name macros as well. You're not allowed spaces there. Make sure you hit enter here. This is what I always forget to do. If you don't hit enter, it doesn't change the name. That cell is now called funding allowance. It's not called I2 anymore. It's called funding allowance. So if I go to the that big nested if statement that we've just created with the ands in it and all the complication there, and I just change the I2 part of it to funding allowance. As I start to type, you can see that it's spotted that I'm probably about starting to type a named cell, and it's given me a list of all the named cells that are in the whole spreadsheet. There is only one, so I can double click that, which finishes it off automatically. That saves you accidentally misspelling it, and then it won't know which cell you're referring to. Same here, as I start to type it in, you get a automatic completion little box here, suggestions of what you might want to be typing. Double click on that, and you can see I've changed the name within the formula from I2 to funding allowance, which is referring to this cell I2 over here, which has £1,000 in it. And if I hit enter there, it's obviously okay for the first one. But if I autofill down, will it work? Yes, it does. And if we look at one of the formulas, because I've used a named cell there, there's no problems with relative or absolute cell referencing. It's just, as I go up and down with the arrow keys there, you can see it just refers to funding allowance. So that's a neat way around the problem of having to use relative and absolute cell referencing, is to use a named cell instead. And as I say, it does meet one of the criteria of the unit as well, which is an added bonus. Finally, the total funding figure in column G is simply the last two added up. It's simply basic funding plus extra funding. So that's simply going to be equals a simple formula after all these very complex ones. Equals basic funding, which in the case of art and design is E2, plus extra funding, which is F2. Hit enter. They're getting no funding because they have no students, and autofill that down. So that's the end of this video there. You've learnt about about linking cells to other cells in the same spreadsheet, other worksheets in the same spreadsheet. You've learnt about the COUNTIF function, which was, where is it there, COUNTIF in the number of attendees. Some simple functions in there as well, multiplying and adding, and a very complicated nested if statement, which also included the logic function and. You've revisited absolute and relative cell referencing, and you've learned how to do a named cell as well with the funding allowance there. So well done. Give yourself a pat on the back if you've done all that. If you want to work through it again, then of course you can rewind and pause and so on. And I'll see you on the next video, which will be about how we can use macros to create a navigation system so that we don't have to use these very small little tabs here down on the bottom here to go between the various worksheets. We can make a new worksheet with much larger links on it to move around the worksheet. So I'll see you on the next video. Bye.